Guys, welcome back. So finally, we have Sebastian Vetter. Sebastian discovered his love for Python early in his university days. Since then, he has used it in his academic research, financial testing, and web development. Please welcome Sebastian and his talk, Click, a pleasure to write, a pleasure to use.
Hi, everyone. It's interesting to see how intimidating a small room with a lot of people is versus a big room with a few people. So I hope you're, as Python community people, are as nice to me as I have learned to appreciate. So it's always, even though this isn't the first time I'm giving this talk, it's always nerve-wracking, especially the first 2 minutes, so bear with me. What I'm going to talk about is Click. My name is Seb. I live in Vancouver in Canada. I used to live here in Melbourne. And I work for a company called Mobify as a backend engineer. And that's sort of, we mostly work with Python on the backend. We have a couple of websites. They are all either Django or Flask. And that's sort of where our most prominent Python use is. But there is also other use cases for Python, and that's sort of where this talk comes in. We have like all of the DevOpsy kind of stuff that comes with having a web application. You basically need to deploy your application, or you have like certificates that you have to push to AWS or things like that, things that you want to automate. And Python is really good at that as well. So I generally try to write everything that I do that can be codified in a Python script or something like that. And there is stuff like bash scripts that you can write, but I personally prefer Python because it has a couple of things that I'll go into that make it much easier or much more maintainable as well than a bash script. Before I get into that, just a little bit of terminology as I'll use it, just so that we don't talk about the different things, the same things in different ways. When I talk about parameters on the command line, there's basically two types, technically three. There is the argument, which is, there is the argument, there is the option, and the type of option, which is the flag. And an argument is basically a mandatory parameter that you have to pass in, otherwise the application will say, no, I don't know what to do. And it's usually just the value itself. And in this case, if you look at the PG CLI client, you pass in a database URL, and that contains all the information about how to connect to the database. If you don't give it that, then it doesn't really know what to do. In the case of an option, options are, as the name suggests, optional. They are usually name-value pairs that identify what option does this value refer to. And in this case, I've got a couple of examples. If you use Heroku, the Heroku toolbar is probably something that you're familiar with. --help or -h is one of the probably most prominent options that you find on almost every Unix tool or every command line client. And there is others like in the bottom case, --app, specifying which app on Heroku you're currently using. There is also a thing that not every command line client really has. It's called a command or a subcommand. Pip does have that. As we see at the bottom, pip install. Install in this case would be a subcommand. And it's one of the things that is very difficult to get with anything but Click. Or I haven't really found a good framework that actually provides that. It's a way of grouping commands together, grouping options to a specific set of commands, and one of the things that I really appreciate. So one of the things that I generally hear when I talk to people about that, it's like, well, I can write all of that in plain Python, so why would I use something like that? And that's true. You can do that. You can just import sys and then look at the argv list and extract all the options and arguments from that. The unfortunate thing about that, though, is that you get all the manual parsing you have to write yourself. Well, as manual implies. You have to do all the work yourself. You have to do the input validation to a certain degree yourself. You always have to do some level of input validation if it's a very specific type of input to your use case. But stuff like, I need an integer, I expect an integer, you can get that for free, and you don't have to rewrite that in every script that you use. And there is also help text generation and better formatting than like writing a function that you output whenever someone types in help and that you manually maintain separate from your regular code. So Python is a language that has a big standard library. There is usually a solution for everything. Most likely, if it's a very common problem, it is part of the standard library. And this is the case for the problem of a command line client as well. So we have opt-parse, we have arg-parse, and we have dog-opt. We have a lot of other tools as well that are smaller niche clients. The advantage of something like opt-parse is that it has been part of the standard library for quite some time, but it has also been deprecated now. So it will still be part of Python 2.3 plus and 3.2 plus, but it will no longer get any feature additions or bug fixes in that sense. What it looks like is we have, we define a parser, and then we can add options to that, define what type of input it is, define whether it's a flag or not. And then at the bottom, we just do a parse args, which basically takes a look at sys argv and then extracts things and validates that these options either have been specified if they are mandatory, or whether their values are the values that we expect. The alternative, and the one that is now the default or the standard in the standard library, is arg-parse, which has been introduced as a successor for opt-parse to introduce new features that wouldn't be able to provide in our opt-parse without breaking the API. So this is the new way to go if you just want to use stuff in the standard library. And it looks fairly similar. The only major difference for a simple use case is that you have the ability to specify the arguments as well and not just the options. And at the bottom, you get out a lookup of all the options and arguments that you have specified. This is all in a standard library, easy to use. You don't have to install anything. There is also another contender, doc-opt, that takes a very different approach to that and says, write down how you want the help text to look for this command line client. I'm going to look at that and infer what the options or the arguments should be, which looks a little bit like this, where you basically define your, this looks like the standard output that you get when you do the dash double dash help or dash H on a Unix tool. And it basically gives you the validation by inferring it from the documentation. It's a nice way of doing it. I don't necessarily like it that much. So here's Click. I came across Click probably 3 years ago and started to use it more and more and more, and I really like it. It's been written by Armin Ronacher. He's the author of Flask, for example. So he has a he is very opinionated about things. And in this case, he has very good opinions that match up with the ones that I have. So yeah, this is basically the URL where you can find the documentation. And the documentation is very extensive and very good. The reasons why I like it is that it's very Pythonic. It is very intuitive to use as soon as you go through the first getting started section. And it is built to be very composable. And you can move things around easily and nest or group together certain commands and subcommands. It also has a very good handling of inputs and outputs and getting things like colored outputs and stuff like that. And he has a post as part of the documentation on why Click and why he built it in the first place. So I recommend giving that a read if you're interested in that. But let's take a look at what it actually means to build a command line client with Click. And it all starts with obviously setting up the project, which can be a lot of boilerplate. The most important part is obviously installing Click. But getting around the boilerplate is something that can be easily done with this at the top there is a little cookie cutter project that I've set up on GitHub for all of the things command line client that I write. So I just throw cookie cutter at that repo, and what I get out is a readily set up project that has a first main entry point that I can use and then extend from there. The code example in here is going to be, is on GitHub, so the bottom link gives you all the code in steps of commits according to what we go through here. So if you want to take a look at that and look at the different steps and refactors, you'll be able to see that there. The slides will be up on speaker deck. So basically, when I start a project, that's what I do. I run my cookie cutter against that repo. I do an install, and then I can actually run this, and I can see the output of a print statement. And this is basically what the corresponding code looks like. It's basically you import Click, and then everything else is going to be a decorator around functions. So click.command defines the main function as your main entry point to the Click command line tool that you're building. The example that I'm going to go through is I was looking for a bike recently, and Craigslist has a nice search, save your search, get emails feature, but the bike ad site that I was using didn't have that. So I wrote a little command line client that would just recurrently pull down the results and then figure out which ones are new, which ones are not, and send me an email. So we use that as a bit of an example. Some of that might be a little bit engineered for illustrating some examples here, but that's sort of the idea. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a URL that has all the query parameters for the search in it, and I want to specify that to my command line client. And so what I do, the command line client is called add notifier, and then I pass in as a mandatory argument my URL that gets processed, and it tells me how many ads I have in there. So here are the arguments that we talked about earlier. And it's basically pretty easy. We extend our initial example. We add another wrapper decorator. We give it the name of the argument that we want. And then Click automatically puts that argument into the function as one of the function arguments. And then I can just use that as I normally would parameters that get passed into the function. We hand that over to a find ads function that grabs the stuff, uses beautiful soup or something like that, and then gives me a list of ads out. So that was pretty easy. Let's look at getting the notification email that we want for all the ads that we get. That's sort of a good example for using an option on the command line. I want to just pass that in because I might have like different people that I want different search results. Same here. It goes through, it processes the URL, finds the ads, but this time it sends it out via email to the email that I specified. So we're looking at the options, and this is pretty similar. We add, there is another decorator in Click that is called option, very straightforward. You give it exactly what you want on the command line, --email, and then that gets transformed into, by dropping the double dashes, and like dashes get turned into into underscores or something like that. It gets passed in as a parameter into the function as well, and then we can use it the same way. An interesting feature of Click is that if you have a sort of 12-factor setup as on Heroku or in other platforms, you can actually specify envvar as an option to the decorator and say, this is the environment variable, and if I don't pass in the option, look if you can find that variable and take it from there. So I can basically export that URL on the command line or in my environment and then take it out of there and don't have to specify it every time. Or I can pull secrets out of there that I have exposed on the environment. I said before that this feature is sort of about getting information about new ads, not like here's everything. So looking at that, we probably have some sort of caching layer that stores all the ads that we found and then only extracts the ones that are new. And what comes with that is one of the problems in computer science, cache invalidation. So for something like either I have it run locally and I want to test it, or basically just running it multiple times without actually caching any data, I might want to use a flag that basically disables the cache or resets the cache. Regardless of how we implement that, whether we don't connect to Redis or don't store things in a file. So flags are sort of special options. They have a default value, and by using them, we basically flip that value from like either false to true or true to false. And it's, again, very simple to do that. We can specify the option with a default value and then say, this is a flag, so just treat it as such and flip that value to whatever the opposite is. And then we can use that in whichever way we want in our code. Again, and this is an example where the dash in the option actually gets turned into an underscore, so that it's actually a usable Python variable. So this is where it gets a little bit engineered, because most people would say, well, if you want to run this periodically, you could just throw it into something like cron or stuff like that. But I want to make a point here, so I'm not going to accept that. So let's say we want to run it as a periodic task, or we want to run it just like the way we did it before. And if we run it as a periodic task, we might want to have a subcommand that says run periodically, whereas the other one is run once. And as you can see, up here, there is an extra option that we don't have in the example below that is specific to that subcommand. And looking at that, we have to do a little bit of refactoring, because suddenly we have two commands, which means two entry points. How do we actually do that? And that's where Click is really powerful, because it allows us to have a group. And the group says, this is the main entry point, and then you can attach subcommands to that group. So we wrap our main class in that decorator, and then use main instead of click.command to wrap our subcommands. And then basically the rest looks pretty much the same. This is the run once command, and then we add that extra option just to the subcommand for our run every 5 minutes option that we have. So this is pretty nice. But a lot of people would say, well, it's a little bit ugly because we have those options on both of those functions, and this isn't really dry. So one of the things that is a little bit under the hood of Click is contexts. Every command and subcommand runs within a certain context. And you won't ever see that unless you use it explicitly. So Click has this pass context decorator that will basically result in the first argument being passed into the wrapped function being a context. And that's the context that Click automatically generates for that specific command. What the context contains a lot of stuff and a lot of the things you never really actually need, but it contains a special object attribute. And this is something for the developer to use for whatever they want. So you could put an object in there. You could put a dictionary in there, like we'll do in a minute, or treat it whichever way you like. Click is not going to touch that. It'll just forward it into all the subcommands that you have. So in our group, we can basically take all the options that are global, put them into that main group entry point, and then just throw them into a dictionary and attach them to that context object. And then in our individual subcommands, all we have to do is basically say pass context because we want to get the context. And we can take that context and have access to all the data that we put in there earlier. And that makes it very easy to see what's going on here. And we only have one additional option on that run periodically function. So that gives us quite a bit of sort of a first impression of what we can do with Click. What I said earlier is that there is also documentation is generated in a very easy, nice, and Pythonic way. Because what you do is to get something like this, which is basically just running the command with -h, is actually not that much. All I have to do is on the option, have an extra help equals, and then provide a string. And for any of the commands or subcommands that I have, I can just use the regular docstring for documentation, and I should be using that anyways if I write any piece of code that's a function or a module or something like that. And that basically gives us the documentation printed out exactly like this. So for me, that's a very nice experience in writing quick scripts that actually give me a little bit of validation. It feels very Pythonic through using the decorator pattern. And there is a lot of very simple validation that you get for free without actually doing any additional work. What I would recommend is checking out some things like the environment variables in the documentation. There is also a pretty big section on parameter types that make handling of files very easy. So if you say my input is a file, you actually get, does this file exist for free? And things like that, where you can ensure you don't have to check for the file yourself, because that's one of the common things that you have when you want a file passed in is, does this file actually exist? There's also a lot of testing, and there are some things like bash autocompletion that you get for free. So if you just have it installed through setup.py, then you basically have, assuming your shell is bash, you get bash autocompletion. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions if you have any.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian, for your talk. Yeah, sure, any questions? Yep.
Have you ever tried to convert like a decent sized command line tool that's just using argparse to using click?
No. Yeah. Not decent sized. Like the small scripts that I write, I've done that, but not to a sort of like large scale. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk, Seb. I just wanted to ask about validation. You mentioned validation right at the end there. I know you can do it for file types. Is there any other types of validation, like if I want to ensure it's an email address or a path or a URL or something like that?
There are certain types that are coming with Click. So there is like UUID validation, for example. There are all the basic types for Python. There is no email validation. When I was putting this together, I actually looked for that, and there is no way of doing that. There is a way of writing your own parameter type subclasses that basically do custom validation to whatever your use case is. But like something like email is not part of Click itself.
Yep. Anyone else? Yep.
With the automatic help generation, can you sequence that in a specific order, say a more user-friendly order?
That's a good question. I don't know that. But I'm pretty sure it'll be described in the documentation.
So I'm just curious, is there a way of validating, say, an integer input for a range? So say it's only valid if it's between 1 and 10?
I think there is a type that allows you to say, this is a range, so give me, validate that it is within that range, or that it is of a specific type and within that range. Yes.
Any more? Yeah.
Does Click have anything built in for showing progress of long-running command line tasks?
I don't think so, but that's also where I would, again, refer you to the documentation.
Anyone else?
Do you have to do anything special to unit test these things?
So you basically, the way you write your functions, you can basically just do unit testing as you usually would of the individual units. But there is an additional test framework that comes with Click that gives you the ability to sort of fake execute the actual command line tool. That'll basically handle some of the validation edge cases that you might have where you can check the passing in of parameters and options and things like that.
No one else? Okay, well, I guess that's it. Sebastian, I have one more thing. On behalf of PyCon Australia 2016, I'd like to present you a small gift.
Thank you.
Please, a round of applause for